Welcome to the Road to Jesus with Pastor Fred here at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. Today we're covering Numbers chapter 18 through Numbers chapter 34. As we enter chapter 20 of Numbers, we find a curious incident that people begin to complain about not having water again, and so God tells Moses for the second time to take his staff and strike a rock. Simple enough instruction. Moses, however, struck the rock twice instead of once. And God gets incredibly angry with Moses about this, even bans him forever setting foot in the promised land because of his disobedience. The question is, why such a severe punishment? Well, Moses was showing distrust of God, and in striking the rock twice, he was indicating that maybe he had something to do with the water coming from the rock, that God needed his cooperation in providing water to the people. In other words, Moses was beginning to think that God needed him and to deliver his people. God wanted to make clear that he was the one who was feeding his people by hand through the daily manna and later meat and the water. It tells us that although God does give us things to do for him in this world, that the success of those things is not dependent upon us, but upon God alone. It also speaks to our salvation, which is 100% an act of God and 0% us. It is shortly after this that Aaron dies. He has been Moses' voice all these years. He was also the guy responsible for the golden calf incident, but Aaron was a man of faith who helped Moses lead the nation of Israel out of slavery, and so his death is significant. The story of the bronze serpent in Numbers chapter 21 is one of the more significant stories in the Old Testament. As the people traveled, they began to complain against Moses and God, and so God sent fiery serpents among them that bit them, and many of them began to die. Well, you can just imagine how terrifying this must have been. So the people go to Moses, and they say, hey, we have sinned against God. Please save us. And that's where it gets strange. God tells Moses, make an image of the fiery serpent that's biting them, and put it on a pole and have them look at it in faith, and they will live. Interesting enough, this symbol has also been the symbol of the medical community for years. But more importantly, we have to ask, what is this supposed to mean? Let's see. A snake that is biting them gets put on a pole, and they look at it in faith, trusting God's promised deliverance and that they will live after they've been bitten. We don't have to think too hard to connect this snake to the one in the Garden of Eden that Adam and Eve, when they were led into sin, and also the promise that God gave them that a Savior would come, and included the words that Satan would strike the Savior's heel and that Jesus would crush Satan's head. Also, the snake is put on a pole, the same thing as a cross, and if people look at Jesus on the cross, in faith they will be healed. Now, the fact that it's a snake on a pole is a little confusing until you remember how Paul talks about Jesus becoming sin for us. That on the cross, all of the world's sin and awfulness were on Jesus as he suffered and he died. Jesus, of course, uses this story to describe himself in the Gospel of John to Nicodemus. He says he will be lifted up like the snake in the desert to draw all people to himself. Again, the Old Testament people get a vision of what is coming when the Messiah arrives, what he's going to do for them. The song at the well is just kind of fun, right? Remember that from kids' songs, Spring Up, Oh Well. Water's always important in the desert. So this song shows people's gratitude for what God has done for them. Now we run into two kings, Sihon and Og. And Sihon was an Amorite and would not allow Israel to pass through his land. And so they went to war with them and defeated the Amorites. But then Og did the same thing, and Israel easily defeated them as well. The significance of these victories is that word began to spread throughout the land that there was this small people group that were defeating much larger armies. It was like God was fighting for them, which he was. Later, when they get ready to cross into the promised land, the people of Jericho, even though they think they have a fortress that no one can take, it says they were filled with fear because they knew what Israel had done to Sihon and Og. In chapters 22 through 24, we get the long story of Balaam. Now, this story is really about God's election of his people and God's sovereignty over his people. And that if God is on your side, well, nothing can come against you that will, in the end, defeat you. The story starts with Balak, who is the head of the Moabites, summoning Balaam to come and curse the Israelite army that he's facing off against. Balaam was a prophet. And Balak sends people to get him and promises to pay him a lot of money. God intervenes and tells Balaam to not go with these men. So Balaam says, sorry. God says no. Well, Balak is not easily put off, and so he sends more people back with even more money. And this time God tells him to go, but says, only say what I put in your mouth. As Balaam is riding his donkey to meet up with Balak, his donkey refuses to go. And Balaam begins to curse and kick the donkey. And God opens the donkey's mouth and he confronts Balaam. God opens Balaam's eyes as well, and he sees the angel of the Lord blocking his path. He tells Balaam, your ways are perverse. And he says, and you better remember to say only what I put in your mouth. So this was a pretty severe warning from God. When he gets to Balak, Balaam tells him, I will do what you ask, but I can only say what God has told me to say. So Balak takes Balaam where he can see the Israelite army, and he tells him to curse them. But instead of cursing them, he actually blesses the Israelite army. Balaam is beside himself with anger, takes him to another location, and Balak ends up blessing the Israelite army yet again. And then this happens a third time, and he ends up cursing Balak later on. As we get into chapter 25, the men of the nation of Israel begin to sleep with foreign women, and they start worshiping the god Baal. It is here that Phinehas, who is a priest, kills an Israelite man and a foreign woman who are together. Phinehas did this because God was sending a plague among them for the immoral behavior. Once Phinehas acted, the plague stopped. In Numbers 26, we get a new census of the people. And this was done because they're about to enter the promised land, and you could say they needed their records updated so they would know who got what tribal land. In chapter 27, we have an interesting side story about 5 sisters who have no male relatives, and this would mean no land or place to live in the promised land. God hears their case and says they have a legitimate claim, and he gives the sisters the land of their dead father. This is one of the many cases where God makes exception to the rules based upon people's real needs. This is also where we see Joshua picked as Moses' successor. In chapter 30, we have a long section on vows. It says if a man makes a vow, he must keep it. However, if a married woman makes a vow or a daughter makes a vow, the husband of the woman or the father of the daughter has to authorize it. If the husband says no, then the vow is void. However, if he says yes or says nothing at all, it is valid. In Numbers 31, God tells the people to take vengeance on the people of Midian for their treatment of the nation of Israel. So the Israelites kill all the men, but leave the women and children and animals. And this angers Moses and the other leaders because they wanted everything killed. Now, God had not said anything about killing everything in this case. This seems to be solely Moses' idea. So Moses has them kill all the males of every age, but he only has them kill the women who are married. If they are not married, he says the soldiers can take them as their wives. He also allows them to keep the animals. It is also in this battle that Balaam is killed from earlier. In later books of the Bible, it said that Balaam was misleading the tribes of Israel by persuading them to sleep with the foreign women and worship their gods. So Balaam, not exactly a good guy, but God uses him anyway. As we get in Numbers 32, the nation of Israel is right outside the promised land. They can actually see it across the Jordan River. And it's here the tribes of Reuben and Gad say, we'd like to stay on this side of the Jordan. The land is good. At first, there's resistance to the idea, but then Reuben and Gad promise to send their armies over to help capture the promised land, even though they will not settle there. In Numbers 33, we get a summary of the Israelites' journey through those 40 years. So if you want to go back and check that out, that's a good summary of it. And then in order to drive out all the inhabitants of the promised land, God says, drive them out of the land and destroy everything associated with their religion and their culture. God says, if you don't, they will corrupt you. Next week, we'll be looking at Numbers 35 through Deuteronomy 16. So thank you for joining us for our Road to Jesus here at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. This is Pastor Fred, and see you next week, and peace out.